On Tuesday, July 5th, 2026, Twitter user Chagrinning Martin posted something that made everyone mad for a couple of days. They wrote of the widely regarded masterpiece Pale Fire. This is the quote tweet. "The issue with modern literature is the need to equate clever equals good writing. The last great novel was written in 1880 and Nab hated it." One can assume the book they're referring to that was published in 1880 was The Brothers Karamazov, which, yes, Vladimir Nabokov, author of Pale Fire, famously hated, as he did all of Dostoevsky, saying of his work, "Dislike him, a cheap sensationalist, clumsy and vulgar." Hey, you don't go to the strong opinions guy if you don't want strong opinions, right? But let's return to the original tweet. The issue Chagrinning Martin has with Pale Fire is not entirely new. Critics have argued and debated for decades over the supposed value of a text that ties its readers into knots for simply trying to unpack what factually happens in the narrative of the text. In his review of Pale Fire in the New York Times in 1962, George Cloyne wrote, "Pale Fire is a curiosity into which it's agreeable to dip rather than a book which can be read straight through with pleasure." I see a sentiment cropping up all over the internet lately of people wanting to return to a time when postmodern tricks weren't corrupting and intellectualizing a form, the novel, which was at its best in the 19th century before people like Joyce, Woolf, and later Nabokov and Pynchon took an axe to it. Is there meaning to be found in a tricky text like Pale Fire? Is this modern book published in 1962 a sign of the death of literature? Before we continue with the strange, and I am not kidding, 3-week-old feud I have personally had with Chagrinning Martin, I need to unpack and explain this book that has consumed my life and my entire mental state for the past month. Vladimir Nabokov wrote Pale Fire shortly after the success and notoriety achieved after the publication of Lolita. Yes, that Lolita. It's a book that holds no punches, that is brilliantly, infuriatingly exactly what it wants to be, even when it is fighting its own form. If you skim through this book, it's not apparent that it's even a work of fiction, though Nabokov has always argued that it's a simple and straightforward novel. You're presented first with a foreword not by Nabokov, but by a man named Charles Kinbote. Then there's a poem written by John Shade, from which the novel's title derives. Then the bulk of the novel is the academic commentary by the same Charles Kinbote, who, as a close friend of the recently deceased poet Shade, helps to explain the text of the poem. Then, crucially, at the very end, there is an index. Already you're probably thinking, like, that's a cool idea, fake commentary written about a fake poem. I promise you it is so much weirder than that. Andrew Ferguson writes in Mirror World Minus World, "I will borrow from the language of programming to present Pale Fire as a drama of patching and overwriting. Moreover, as an experience very near what we can today recognize as a video game, available to multiple, often conflicting modes of play, and also susceptible to and indeed conclusively shaped by programming errors or glitches." Let's first look at the foreword, from which you can pretty much piece together the entire story. I don't believe you can spoil Pale Fire when the plot is pretty much divulged in the first 10 pages, but for those of you wanting to go in completely blind, here is a spoiler warning. Okay. There we go. Charles Kinbote first presents the plain facts of Pale Fire, saying it's a poem of 999 lines written in heroic couplets. Everything about this is normal, but weird digressions keep sticking out in what should be an impersonal introduction. There is a very loud amusement park right in front of my present lodgings. In fact, 80% of this introduction is Kinbote talking about Kinbote, how he got the poem, what means he took to get it, and his gripes with the other academics in this small college town of New Y. He writes, "As mentioned, I think in my last note to the poem, the depth charge of Shade's death blasted such secrets and caused so many dead fish to float up that I was forced to leave New Y soon after my last interview with the jailed killer." A jailed killer! Intrigue, murder, suspense. Kinbote brags about why he is the only and the best critic to be able to edit and comment upon John Shade's final masterpiece, mostly because they were best friends. They were such good friends, guys. They were totally besties, for about 3 months. In just under 30 pages, Nabokov serves us a deliciously unreliable narrator, someone who has no self-awareness, who is implicated possibly in the murder of a beloved poet. Not only that, we can tell that everyone in this small town dislikes Kinbote. When dining with other professors, he makes people really uneasy, saying he refuses to eat anything cooked or served by another human, but he assures us, the readers, that my free and simple demeanor set everybody at ease. Yeah, I'm sure that it did. Totally the vibe we get from you. He later says that drama students in a skit portrayed him as a pompous woman-hater with a German accent. The only solace to Kinbote's alienation is his uniquely intimate connection to the poet John Shade, who was again murdered shortly before Kinbote went into hiding. I experienced a grand sense of wonder whenever I looked at him, especially in the presence of other people, inferior people. I could spend days talking about the foreword alone. It's disarmingly funny and sets up a grand and elaborate parody of academia while weaving some suspenseful threads. A murder mystery. It's a murder mystery, you know? But then, Kinbote writes, although those notes, in conformity with custom, come after the poem, the reader is advised to consult them first and then study the poem with their help. Rereading them, of course, as he goes through its text, and perhaps after having done with the poem, consulting them a third time so as to complete the picture. At this point, like, what do you do? Do you trust the unreliable narrator to read this book out of order? What academic would ever say, obviously, read my commentary first before the text of the poem? In fact, read it way more than the actual poem. Look, I decided to read this book not just because of Chagrinning Martin's Twitter meltdown, which I promise I will continue talking about, but because my book club recently voted to read it. By the way, I have a book club. You can join. It's $2. I have a backlog of videos on James Joyce, The Count of Monte Cristo, Ursula K. Le Guin. We do a monthly Zoom call. Next month, we're reading one of my favorite books of all time, East of Eden. Anyways, several people in the book club told me they read the book in the way Kinbote, our unreliable narrator, suggests. Though Nabokov has insisted it can be read straight through like any conventional novel, the fact that you can read it sort of like a choose-your-own-adventure is incredibly exciting and weird. I know some people who entirely skipped reading the poem itself, including the infamous Chagrinning Martin, who, after, look, admittedly, stupidly, I replied to his rage bait, he found my email address and shared with me, unprompted, a number of opinions about this book, including the claim that the poem of Pale Fire is intentionally bad, a send-up of bloated mid-century poetry. I keep returning to Chagrinning Martin simply because in my public disputes with him, he keeps offering the worst way to read this text. However, in this instance, he's not totally off base. There's been a long-running debate about whether the poem itself is a masterpiece or not. Giles Harvey writes, most readers tend to think of the poem as the grace that must be perfunctorily said before we sit down to the meal of the commentary. I want to go out on a limb and say, no, I think the poem is astonishingly good and moving in a way that is jarring and, again, the word I keep lashing onto, weird. Somehow Nabokov is able to effortlessly imitate a style of mid-century poetry that isn't just mocking it, but it's a genuinely moving work of art. It's a deeply sincere text and so tonally at odds with the madman penning the commentary. About his dying Aunt Maud, Shade writes, she still could speak. She paused and groped and found what seemed at first a serviceable sound, but from adjacent cells impostors took the place of words she needed, and her look spelt imploration as she sought in vain to reason with the monsters in her brain. There's so many beautiful moments in this poem, but none so moving as when Shade details the minutiae of the evening when his daughter commits suicide in an icy lake. Shade writes of his wife, and I love you most when with a pensive nod you greet her ghost and hold her first toy on your palm, or look at a postcard from her found in a book. It's so tender and full of anguish that when you come to the conclusion of the poem, you return to Kinbote's crude commentary with dread. More than ever, you wish this narcissistic loser would shut up about this poet and his grieving family. But Nabokov relishes the twist of his knife. He really does. As Kinbote reminds us, for better or worse, it is the commentator who has the last word. And what is his last word? What does Kinbote have to say about the text of Pale Fire? Predictably and hilariously, almost nothing. Kinbote spends 80% of his commentary sharing stories of the thrilling escape from prison of the former king of Zembla, a nation that was taken over by leftist revolutionaries in the 1950s. You see, Kinbote is himself an exile from Zembla, so it makes sense that he'd be interested in this epic story of King Charles the Beloved's escape. But he goes so far as to complain every few pages over the fact that John Shade did not write his poem about King Charles and the nation of Zembla. Why would he do that? It's a hilarious maneuver watching this commentator wrangle a sincere poem about art and grief into something about his favorite subject. Apparently, for the final 3 months of John Shade's life, Kinbote had been stalking and harassing him into writing a poem about Kinbote's own country, something the poem Pale Fire has nothing to do with. Not only that, Kinbote is, let's put it this way, incompetent as an interpreter and wildly inconsistent. He will go pages and pages sharing anecdotes about Zembla, like the fact that parachuting had become a popular sport. And he usually ends these digressions by saying things like, I trust the reader enjoyed this note. I don't know. Have we really enjoyed this note? What does any of this have to do with anything. Then at other points, he will explain things in the text that are plainly wrong, or things that do not need to be explained at all, or both. Like this, for example. You don't need to tell us who Sherlock Holmes is. Also, Kinbote takes a metaphor from the poem and assumes that Shade is referencing Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Reversed Footprints, a Holmes story that does not exist. Kinbote admits he doesn't know whether it exists or not. He just didn't check. This reconfirms that Kinbote is either A, too lazy to fact check anything, or B, has no access to the library when writing this commentary. Both of which end up being true. In this way, my pen pal and nemesis Chagrinning Martin, yes, our story is still going on, is like Kinbote in that he refuses to fact check anything. We both emailed each other a few times sharing our thoughts on the book, and it was actually pretty fun and civil. He was clearly exaggerating his hatred for the book because he could write very well about it. Admittedly, some of it sounded like ChatGPT. Just me going crazy replying to ChatGPT is very fitting to the themes of the book, I think. Anyways, these emails stopped very suddenly when out of nowhere, Chagrinning Martin tweeted, "Man-carrying thing refusing to condemn leftist revolutionaries in Zembla. Unsurprising but disappointing." I took this as an obvious joke until his frantic replies made it crystal clear. This person read the entirety of Pale Fire and got everything, and I mean everything, wrong. Because here's the thing. If you couldn't tell already, it's pretty obvious. Zembla is not a real country. It's completely made up, and everything Kinbote writes about it could be plucked from a more homoerotic version of the Grand Budapest Hotel. As you read Pale Fire, something becomes so obvious, even more than the fact that Zembla is some crazy bullshit. But it's the fact that Charles Kinbote is, or believes he is, the deposed former monarch of Zembla, Charles the Beloved. He's that delusional. The reason he is so insistent upon forcing Pale Fire, the poem, to be about King Charles is because he is King Charles, cast out of his privilege, left to toil away in an academic world he despises. At a certain point, he stops pretending and instead of using the third person, starts using the first person when talking about himself, King Charles. The fact that Chagrinning Martin, who has around 90,000 followers by the way, crashed out over a detail that could be disproven in 2 seconds is a poetic narrative development in this drama, I think. The fact that this thing is so niche that his tweet earned like 14 likes is the icing on the cake. But don't worry, we're not done with Chagrinning Martin just yet. He won't go out so easily. There are 3 main subjects you need to know to Kinbote's commentary in Pale Fire. The first is the narrative of his relationship to the Shades and his laughable resentment of John Shade's wife, Sybil. Kinbote spies on the Shades. He does everything in his power to ingratiate himself to them, despite the fact that he isn't invited to his birthday party and they so clearly just try to avoid him all the time. Regardless, John Shade is the only person in the whole town who even pretends to like him, who shows this outcast any sort of kindness. A woman in town says to him at one point in the middle of a grocery store, "You are a remarkably disagreeable person. I fail to see how John and Sybil can stand you. What's more, you are insane." He is insane. That becomes clear. The second narrative thread in the commentary is the history of Zembla and the story of King Charles, Kinbote's escape. The third thread in the story is of Gratus, aka Jack Gray, among many other pseudonyms. Gratus is a contract killer sent by the revolutionaries of Zembla to track down and kill King Charles. In the same way Kinbote knows way too much about King Charles, going so far as to describe his intimate thoughts, he too knows Gratus's thoughts way too well. So does that mean Kinbote is also Gratus? It's certainly possible. Maybe? Here's where everything falls apart. It becomes twisted in knots. Here's what Chagrinning Martin called the issue with modern literature, I guess. David Galef writes, "The discrepancy between Kinbote's imagined life and his real circumstances may be greater than many critics assume. David Walker has suggested that Kinbote's motel room is actually the padded room of an asylum. And yet, Nabokov, in an interview, insisted, 'I think it is a perfectly straightforward novel. The clearest revelation of personality is to be found in the creative work in which a given individual indulges. Here the poet is revealed by his poetry, the commentator by his commentary.'" So, who is Charles Kinbote? And what does his commentary reveal? To explain at least the prevailing theory, I need to explain how the book ends. So, as Gratus nears closer and closer to assassinating Kinbote, aka King Charles, John Shade gets closer and closer to finishing his poetic masterpiece, Pale Fire. In a climactic moment, as Kinbote and his best friend, John Shade, walk to Kinbote's house to celebrate the completion of the poem, Gratus stands on Kinbote's front steps and fires multiple shots at Kinbote. Heroically, Kinbote does his best, naturally, to protect his best friend from the bullets, but alas, Tragically, only John Shade is struck and dies. The authorities arrest Gradus, whose alibi is that he escaped from a mental institution. Hilariously, before Kinbote can even check Shade's pulse to see if he's dead or not, Kinbote greedily grabs the manuscript of the poem and hides it away in his house. At this point in the story, you are questioning everything Kinbote says. All of this sounds fishy, right? After killing Shade, Gradus somehow loses his desire to kill the former King Charles, and he just sits waiting for the police to catch him. A gardener witnesses the killing and attests to the events as they transpired, but why does Kinbote flee? Why is he writing the commentary in hiding? Well, my friends, the end of the book is not the end of the book. The index is just as essential to this novel as any other part of it, and it offers some clues. First, it's a hilarious index. It's actually really fun to read. Kinbote's own entry for himself is longer than anything he mentions. His narcissism is just unmatched, except maybe by Chagrinning Martin, who tried to dox me. Second, one entry stands apart, this one here for Botkin, who is mentioned at multiple points in the text. Look, the games being played here are complicated and kind of goofy. I want to direct your eyes to a terrific video, the best video about this book on the internet by the Waxwing Collective. It dives into the specific ways Nabokov reveals this twist, and it's from one of those rare channels that made a single excellent video then dipped. Go check it out, seriously. But to condense the shenanigans and all of the clues, Nabokov suggests that Botkin is Kinbote. It's an anagram of the name, and it tracks very well with the plot of the book. Botkin is referenced as another professor at the school, and at one point another professor confuses Kinbote's name with Botkin's. Botkin is Russian, and his fantasies about Zembla track well with someone who was an exile of Russia and who resents the current former state of the Soviet Union. Of course, Kinbote isn't a deposed monarch. He's a Russian professor, greatly disliked and very annoying and disagreeable. He has delusions of grandeur, and Zembla and his identity as King Charles is just part of his grand delusions. Kinbote is Russian. Kinbote is Botkin. What's more, Mary McCarthy unearthed this interpretation in her great piece, A Bolt from the Blue, which is pretty much required reading for this book, but Nabokov confirmed it himself in an interview. The nasty commentator is not an ex-king of Zembla, nor is he Professor Kinbote. He is Professor Botkin, or Botkine, a Russian and a madman. His commentary has a number of notes dealing with entomology, ornithology, and botany. The reviewers have said that I worked my favorite subjects into this novel. What they have not discovered is that Botkin knows nothing about them, and all his notes are frightfully erroneous. So there you have it. But wait, how does this explain the explosive finale? Why does Gradus try to kill Kinbote, aka Botkin, at the end of the book? How can Gradus be real when Zembla is fake, when Kinbote is fake? If you look closely, another story emerges. Let me lay it all before you, at least my interpretation. There's a lonely, isolated Professor Botkin is going insane. He rents a house from a notoriously vindictive Judge Goldsworth, who keeps a photo album of the criminals he has sentenced. In a throwaway moment, Kinbote remarks that one of these sentenced criminals resembles Gradus. At another moment, others remark that John Shade, the poet, looks a little bit like Judge Goldsworth. So, at the end of the book, as John Shade and Botkin walk back to Botkin's rented house, Jack Gray, an escaped criminal, fires all his bullets at John Shade, not Kinbote, because he mistakes him for Judge Goldsworth, from whom he hopes to extract his revenge. In other words, it's a total misunderstanding. Gray thinks that Shade is Judge Goldsworth. Botkin nevertheless spins it into, of course, being entirely about him. He says as much at the end, that his story is one of a lunatic who intends to kill an imaginary king, another lunatic who imagines himself to be that king, and a distinguished old poet who stumbles by chance into the line of fire and perishes in the clash between the two figments. Figments. Yes, but to what extent, and how much is it Botkin's imagination? Mary McCarthy writes, Pale Fire is not a detective story, though it includes one. Each plane or level in its shadow box proves to be a false bottom. There is an infinite perspective regression, for the book is a book of mirrors. For instance, if Zembla is fake, why is it mentioned in John Shade's poem? There are those, Chagrinning Martin included, who believes that John Shade is a creation of Kinbote. There are others who believe that Kinbote is a creation of John Shade. The book deliciously, maddeningly, calls to attention the fact that this is all fiction. It's all fake. Galef writes, Kinbote changes Jacob Gradus into D'Argus. Jacques de Grey, Jack Gray, all reflections in a really fantastic mirror, signed with a diamond by its maker, Sudarg of Bouquet. The obnoxious faculty member, Gerald Emerald, becomes, through a Russian twist, Izumrudov of the Emerald. Nodo and Odon, two of the shadows, are half-brothers and reversals of one another. This book has kept me up over multiple nights trying to untangle the allusions, the incorrect quotes, the puns, the anagrams. There's so much in here that you could spend, I believe, decades dissecting it, trying to figure out what the capital T truth is, and all I can find are the shattered remnants of human lives. Despite the parlor tricks, Pale Fire is a story about people, about a man going mad, the danger of isolation, and the pale, weak fire of human compassion, the longing for connection. Is not Botkin/Kinboat's obsession with John Shade a sad attempt to connect with another human on a level beyond the superficial? A dark need to express oneself against all the trials of our crazy universe. Indeed, you could ask why any of this matters. Why does fiction matter? What makes Crime and Punishment matter? What makes War and Peace matter? For that matter, what makes Chagrinning Martin matter? Is it not possible that he too is another piece of this interactive puzzle, this stupid video game? Is it not possible he is a total fabrication that I invented, that he in fact is me, a fictional device used not just maybe, hopefully, to trick you into watching a video about a book no one really talks about that much? Is he not an anagram manifestation of me, of my own insecurities and fears? McCarthy writes, "The world is a sportive work of art, a mosaic, an iridescent tissue. Appearance and reality are interchangeable. All appearance, however deceptive, is real." Does Pale Fire matter? Does fiction matter? When I read such achingly sincere lines as these, I think, of course it does. How could it not? But nevertheless, old Kinboat reminds us what the master poet John Shade had to say, if he said it at all. When I hear a critic speaking of an author's sincerity, I know that either the critic or the author is a fool. Unrequited love, yearning, fantasy countries, deposed monarchs. In another universe, Pale Fire is a romantasy novel. It's fun to speculate about what Nabokov would think about romantasy, considering he said of Thomas Mann his work was second-rate, ephemeral, puffed up, and that William Faulkner is a non-entity means absolutely nothing to me. I think it's fascinating to look at the changing trends in publishing, and I can't think of a better video for that purpose than Lindsay Ellis's new video, Time to Pivot to Romantasy, I Guess. I'm a huge fan of Lindsay Ellis's work, and her exclusive work on Nebula, including the one just mentioned, ranks among her very best. It breaks down the tropes of romantasy and the pivot away from the romance genre. It's great, and it's available now along with a ton of other exclusive content from your favorite creators on Nebula. Nebula is the largest creator-owned streaming platform in the world. It's where all your favorite creators like Tom Scott, Captain Midnight, The Morbid Zoo, me, create exciting new content. There's such a variety of smart and engaging videos on Nebula. I end up spending way more time watching stuff there than I do on Netflix or HBO. If you sign up using my link at go.nebula.tv/mancarryingthing or use the link below, you can get Nebula for 50% off, which is $30 a year or $250 a month. You can also get a monthly plan for $6 a month or a lifetime plan for $300, which usually costs $500. And for those of you that want to share everything Nebula has to offer with your family and friends, Nebula is now offering monthly, annual, and lifetime gift cards. Use the link gift.nebula.tv/mancarryingthing to give a month of Nebula to a friend for just $6, a year for $30, or a lifetime membership for $300, which without my link costs $500. Thank you for watching, and thanks as always for supporting the channel. Bye everyone.